Welcome to Environmental Law course, dear learner and viewer. Today we are going to deliver a lecture on the forest and wildlife policy in the series of the environmental policies in contemporary India. We have noted that we had already lectures on our understanding for the environmental policies in India in the colonial perspective and as well as in the perspective of the post-independent India. Now, in the third series of our lecture in understanding the environmental policy in India, we have chosen the contemporary India and we wanted to have a kind of the tracking of the contemporaneous development of the environmental policy in India. For to this end, what we are going to do is primarily that we will be focusing on the forest and the wildlife in India simply because of the fact that the forest happens to be as one of the major source of the environmental uh, uh, resources, and forest is very key to promote sustainable development in India. Therefore, the sustainable management of the forest is the a need of the hour, and the entire forest cover in India, because of some of the policies of the government, have resulted into the decrease of the forest area to a great extent. And then we realize that the forest cover in India must be increased. At the time of independence, we witnessed more than 36% of the forest cover, but because of the indiscriminate use and denudation of the forest resources, the forest area was reduced to 11%. It was only after the enactment of the Forest Conservation Act in 1980 that a solemn resolution has been made to increase the forest cover. And as of now, what we find that the forest cover in India happens to be 21 and 22% of the entire land. Now, the National Forest Commission is one of the area from where we can understand that how the contemporary environmental policy in India by two major policy specification, forest and wildlife policy, happens to have a very important milestone in realizing the goals of environmental conservation and as well as the sustainable forest management. Therefore, what we see that the National Forest Commission will be reviewed in our lecture, and we will also see that concomitant to the National Forest Commission 2006, we have a Forest Right Act 2006, which recognized the rights of the forest dwelling community and tries to remedy and compensate some of the historical injustices which has been accrued by the, the state policy in relation to the traditional forest folk and the traditional forest dweller, the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe, and people living in the forest area. It also tried to see that how the National Forest Cover has been one of the major documents in heralding a new forest policy, shifting from the revenue-based or revenue-focused use to a kind of a conservation and sustainable development use by emphasizing the protection, restoration, and utilization of the forest resources as an essential for environmental balance and developmental planning. In this lecture, having discussed the National Forest Commission and Forest Right Act and the National Forest Policy and its paradigmatic shift, we will try to see that what are the background of the National Forest Commission. Dear learner and viewer, it needs to be mentioned at this stage that there was a case known as T.N. Godavaran. And in T.N. Godavaran case, what we witnessed that right from 1997, we have a series of the decision regarding forest conservation, and this series is known as forest conservation cases. The catena of the forest conservation cases which has been filed by T.N. Godavaran has resulted into a rethinking and reorientation that how we can have a very careful and very vibrant approach to increase the forest cover in the country, and therefore the National Forest Commission had in background that whatever decision has been taken right from 1997 to 2003, it requires a commission to be set up, and this commission was set up by Justice B.N. Kirpal in 2003, which tried to see that whether the present forest law, meaning thereby the Forest Act 1927 and Forest Conservation Act 1980, how far these two laws has been important in giving impetus to the sustainable forestry, sustainable development and management of the forest, along with that as from the estate list to concurrent list, the forest was shifted by 42nd Constitutional Amendment, and the shifting of the forest from estate list to concurrent list in the 7th schedule to the Constitution of India has been a very important milestone in the sense that the central government have taken the cudgels in their hands to see that the forest resources must remain in the hands of center, and a kind of a distrust has been reposed against the state because the state in India have miserably failed in conservation of the forest. And then the Forest Conservation Act 1980 has a provision known as Section 2 and Section 3, and these two sections tries to give emphasis. The one point is that no forest land can be used for non-forest purposes. So, one is the non-forest purposes and the forest purposes. So, any diversion of the forest land for the non-forest purposes has been banned under the Section 3, and it can only be done by the prior approval of the central government. And after the enactment of law, it was hoped that India's forest will be revitalized, and then after the successive failures of the forest cover and the forest management, it was realized by the Supreme Court and its decision on T.N. Godavaran from 1997 to 2003. A series of decisions has been presented as a last-ditch battle to save India's forest, and thereby saving of the forest resources in this country happens to be one of the major and stupendous tasks. And for that, Justice B.N. Kirpal was appointed as the chairperson of the National Forest Commission, which submitted its report in 2006, which have reviewed in a very threadbare manner the entire forest policy, administration, and governance. It also tried to see that how the long-term forest and wildlife can be managed by the betterment of the wildlife, by betterment of the community participation, and then overall that the forest resource and the forest management along with the management of the wildlife resources can give a renewed energy for communities' participation, because what we see that in the Forest Act 1927 and even Forest Conservation in 1980, that the communities were just tried to be alienated, and the alienation of the community that resulted into the loss of the forest, because once you try to sanitize the local population and the population which happens to take care of the forest resources, then then the forest resource is heavily dependent on the state and the bureaucratic governance, and most often than not, the excessive reliance on the bureaucratic governance and the state administration, then the forests are not being managed, because this community has also a very cardinal role in creating the forest resources to the fore and having a very comprehensive biodiversity conservation mechanism. Therefore, the Forest Commission report in 2006, that it has not only realized it but also submitted as many as 360 recommendations on various facets. The one is the legal, another is administrative, another is a social reform. And then the 360 recommendation of the National Forest Commission is something very important and epoch-making exercise which has been done along with the National Environmental Policy 2006 vis-a-vis the National Forest Commission, vis-a-vis that Environment Impact Assessment notification. All these major leap and the quantum leap have taken in 2006, and all these deserves a kind of a detailed study, because what we are going to discuss here is the environmental policies in contemporary India. So we have to get ourselves abreast with the contemporaneous development of the environmental policy, and for that end we have chosen the National Forest Commission as a point of reference, as a mooting point to see that how the contemporary India has a kind of a policy which have pursued by the country to see that the forest cover and the net effect of these National Forest Commission 2006 and its recommendation. And since last 2 decades, the National Forest Commission happens to be one of the very important milestone in creating sustainable forest in India. So primarily what we see that the term of reference of the Forest Commission was to see not only the forest, but we should have forest and wildlife both together. We have to see a very holistic perspective, the forest and the wildlife sector, and the term of reference is evident from the fact that it not only review and assess the entire spectrum of existing legal policy and the legal framework, and then it tries to see the entire forest resources in a very holistic perspective, and that holistic perspective is rested upon number 1 ecological, number 2 economic, number 3 social, and number 4 is the cultural point of view. And all these 4 point of view where the hallmark of the term of reference and any kind of a review of the forest laws and policy in India must have these kind of the consideration. Then what we see that that the term of reference of the Forest Commission also resolved to examine in detail that what is the current status of the forest administration. That means that IFS, that means the wardens and the chief wardens of the wildlife and all forestry institutions which are engaged in honing out their strategy, research and development to meet the sustainable development goal or sustainable forestry in India. It also tried to see that how at Indian level, how at the state level, we have to meet the emerging needs of the society vis-a-vis that, because it is one of the term of reference happens to be the cultural viewpoint of the forest. That is also very important. Besides what importance has been given to the ecological, economic, social, then cultural is also very important, and how that cultural association has been promoted or accelerated in the forest administration and the forestry institution, right from at the national level to the state level to the village level and at the level of the society, civil society. If the term of reference of the National Forest Commission also happens to make certain suggestion indicating a specific policy options for achieving sustainable development, and it also wanted to see that how a sustainable development of the forest can be roped with the entire notion and concept of the wildlife management and management of the habitat, management of sanctuaries, management of the reserve forest, and overall what we see that be it sanctuary, be it reserve forest, be it wildlife park. So the park, sanctuaries, and the reserve forest and the state forest taken together, how these are going to create a kind of a ecological security in matters of the environmental conservancy, environment protection, and sustainable development. The term and reference of the Forest Commission is also to suggest means that how it can promote an effective forest administration, whether the forest administration which is on the throes of transition requires some major upheavals, the major reform, so that the goal of sustainable development or the sustainable forestry and to save the endangered species from the brink of disaster and extinction, that how a better forest administration can be resolved by the policy option. The term and reference of the National Forest Commission also talks about what we can say is the point that how we can forge a meaningful partnership and interface between the forestry management and the local communities, including the tribal communities, in giving effect to the sustainable development of the forest in India. One of the major outcomes of the National Forest Commission's recommendation is so immediately and so evidently visible to us is the enactment of the Forest Right Act, which deserves to be mentioned, although when we will be discussing a separate lecture on or many lectures on the forest conservation laws and policy in India, and whereby we will take note of all the major enactment on the forest, and as well as we will also take note of all the major decisions and the case law on the development of the forest resources in this country. We will be having an occasion to discuss the Forest Rights Act 2006. Nonetheless, what we need to mention here at an immediate point, an immediate evidence of the effort and the recommendations of the National Forest Commission is to see the enactment of the Forest Rights Act in 2006, which recognized and which tries to mete out some of the historical injustices which has been done to the forest dwelling community and the traditional community, indigenous community, scheduled caste, scheduled tribe in their matter of entitlement of the traditional forest resources, minor forest produce, and other forest produce which they are entitled to have right from the very beginning. The Forest Rights Act 2006 also try to confer some very broad rights to the Gram Sabha as a central agency deciding the nature, the content, the ambit, the scope of the right, and it also try to see that how the four types of right, meaning thereby most of the rights of the people and in the forest areas are not documented, not chronicled, not properly evidenced. So how we can establish the title, that determination question was left to the Gram Sabha and the community, and title, the use, relief and development, and the management right of the forest resources. The Forest Rights Act 2006 also tried to democratize the entire forest governance by promoting a participatory regime of the forest resources. Then what we see that the net impact of the Forest Commission Report 2006 as well as the Forest Rights Act 2006 happens to be a kind of a paradigm shift into the entire management of the forest resources. Therefore, what we see that during these 2 decades, that as it has been evident that in 1 decade the forest cover, or it has been expanded by a very robust and intelligent policy specification and the recommendation which has undergone to what we can call the Forest Commission Report 2006, and what we can say about the implementation and giving a space to the local community and forest dwellers in realizing their rights under the Forest Rights Act of 2006. It is evident from the India's State of Forest Report to 2023, which has been released in December 2024. This is a very recent report, and this report determines the contemporary forest policy. What we are going to discuss is the forest and wildlife policy in contemporary India, and that contemporary India means that this forest policy is evident that by the report of 2024, which shows that India's forest grew from 2013 to 2023 in a massive way, and then this kind of a massive expansion of the forest cover is something very important, in the sense that the massive cover is important because that it tries to seek the country's carbon sink. It becomes a sinking point, and then that's why we see that which has reached to 30 billion tons of carbon dioxide, then equivalent to 2.29 billion tons since 2005. Then how, in creating a carbon-free economy, the carbon-free economy, then this forest cover happens to be very important, and we see that there has been a sizable development, as the people must generally the data shows that right from 21 to 22% forest cover happens to be in the contemporary India, which was earlier 11%, and earlier at the time of independence that the forest cover was 36%. So that way we can say that right from independence to 1980 onward, and 1980 to 97, the T.N. Godavaran cases, and then we see 2003 and 2006, then there has been a gradual realization of the fact, and there has been a gradual shift in management of the forest resources and expansion of the forest resources, and this progress is aligning with India's nationally determined contribution and target of 2.5 to 3.0 billion tons by 2030. So this target of which has been set by 2030 by the national determined contribution is something hopes to be, and we have a very pious wish and pious hope that it reflect in strong strides in forest conservation and in reducing the fire incident in the forest area. So that is something very salubrious to note, and which can be attributed to the Forest Rights Act 2006, and then Forest Rights Act 2006, and as well as the 360 recommendations of overhauling the entire forest governance and administration by the Forest Commission Report 2006. In this way, we can say that besides the forest, the other area which happens to be conservation of the wildlife, and this conservation of the wildlife, which is very important for biodiversity richness and as well as the biodiversity hotspot. Here it is important to mention that India passed the Wildlife Protection Act 1972 in compliance with the International Site Convention, which was also been reached in 1972. So India was very quick in conserving its wildlife protection and conservation. Therefore, we have a series of the wildlife programs. The one in the contemporary India is 2017 to 2033. This is a kind of a goal which has been set. First, it was introduced in 1983 and subsequently it undergone to amendment and updating, and then the National Wildlife Action Plan slightly try to see a broader environmental and biodiversity goal and addresses International Convention on Wildlife Conservation. The three phases of the National Wildlife Action Plan is very important to understand in the sense that we must take note of the first phase 1983 to 2001, the second phase which happens to be 2000 to 2016. In these two phases, what has been done that it increased, the second phase of the plan include that the challenges which were very formidable, the one that the increased commercial use of the natural resources, growth of the human and livestock population, changes of in consumption pattern and rising interest in the biodiversity conservation all has been encompassed in the action plan of 2017 to 2031 as a major target. So we have a three-tier or the three phases of the National Wildlife Action Plan along with the forest conservation laws and policy and commissions. And in this way, what we see that the third phase of the National Wildlife Action Plan, which is in practice and virtue in 2017 to 31, is being very important. And it is important from the point of view that it tries to improve the protected area network. It tries to see that the landscape level approach for the wildlife conservation. It tries to address the question of rehabilitation of threatened species. It also touches upon, because the Indian wildlife is partly marine wildlife and plain wildlife, hilly wildlife. So in this case, the salient features of the National Wildlife Action Plan 2017 has talked about inland aquatic ecosystem, conservation of not only the coastal but marine ecosystem, and then it tried to see that how the climate change impact happens to be in the wildlife planning and what kind of the planning and can be made to integrate and to meet the climate change requirement, and then how we can control the trafficking in the wildlife, how we can meet our requirement by internalizing the national wildlife laws and policy with the international convention and improve the human wildlife interface, and at the same time we must ensure that there is a kind of a people's participation and there is a sustained funding and the sustained growth and a sustained research in the area of the wildlife. Then what we see that right from the National Forest Policy and the Wildlife Action Plan of the three phases and the contemporary phase, which is very important, then what we see that whether it is going to create a kind of a situation wherein we can have the reform and the refurbishment of the existing wildlife policy and laws, because the three action plans are very important. I think that these three action plans, which has been constantly and gradually following that what are the imperatives of conservation and what are the imperatives of sustainable development, and how that the national law and the international law relating to the wildlife in a series of the problems and the matters can be combined together, have to see in a right perspective, and that right perspective is something that we have to go a long way. Can we refurbish, or we can come out from the traditional sets of laws of the British period like the Fisheries Act like the Elephant Preservation Act, like the World Wild Birds and Animal Protection Act, or we can have a new sets of law like we have Wildlife Protection Act 1972 and whether the Environment Protection Act. We have to really appraise these laws from that point of view, whether these regulations and policies are going to have some kind of an innovation or some kind of a change into a kind of the scenario where we can see that India's forest and the wildlife law in a contemporary perspective happens to be very up to date and remarkable and something very effective. So we require a slew of law reforms in matters of forest, and as well as like we have a Forest Conservation Act 1980, or we can have the same Forest Act, or we should require a new Forest Act, and vis-a-vis that how the National Green Tribunal Act as a major environmental dispute authority and a court can resolve the conflicts of the human being with that of the man and nature and with that of the extraction and denudation of the forest resources and extinction of the wildlife resources, how this National Environment Tribunal Act is going to resolve all kinds of the malaise and the crisis which has been permeated in the contemporary scenario of the two major environmental policies in relating to forest and wildlife law. With this, dear learner, I hope that when we are in a discussion of the environmental policies in contemporary India, our understanding of the forest and wildlife policies in contemporary India will be an addition to our knowledge to see that what sets of environmental law in general and what sets of forest law in particular, what sets of wildlife law in particular are to be required and what reforms are to be carried forth. With this, I thanks and I wish you a happy learning.